Okay, everyone. A different take on context mapping. So, follow your dreams, they say, right? So, I always wanted to become a DJ. So, today, what I'm going to be doing is remixing some of other people's best works. Uh, so, don't expect too many authentic ideas here. But if anything, I want to ask you all to take some of these things that you hear here today back home, back to your offices, and listen to them there and see how they sound in your environment and maybe dance a little bit to them. Okay? So imagine you're going somewhere. What are the first apps that you open on your smartphone? Google Maps, Facebook? Okay, well, I don't know about that one. How about the weather? I had to come here with the bike. If it was raining, perhaps I would have chosen a different strategy. Perhaps a traffic application to see. And we do this because we want situational awareness. And we want to make the best decisions given our constraints, the constraints in our environment. And perhaps the idea that we initially had isn't the right one. And in order to communicate about that, we can use maps because maps show a lot of our assumptions. And when we're talking about maps in DDD, we typically talk about context maps, which Eric Evans talked about in his book already. What is it, 15 years ago, where he mentions a context map is somewhere in between the overlap of system design and project management. It shows us how we've conceptually separated the various aspects of our system. And the map should provide us with two things. It should help us understand what bounded contexts are at play so that the names can enter our ubiquitous language, so that we can reason about the models in context. And when I'm talking about a ticket in the context of ticket control versus ticket selling, that helps shape the conversation and it helps talk about our assumptions. But the second thing is that whenever we're talking about our designs, whenever we're looking at a piece of code, we want to understand where in that landscape we are. And that is what a context map fundamentally provides. The possibility to communicate about our situation. And so it contextualizes the design, where the boundaries are, so that we can recognize them in any situation. So I don't know how you've been making context maps, but let's see if the remote works. Yes, this is one slightly changed from a realistic project, and we can see a whole bunch of things. We can see bounded contexts and things that were perhaps once a bounded context, but then we started adding a whole bunch of stuff on top of them. Is that thing that's called logistics here and customer support and forecasting, is that really a bounded context? Well, a bounded context should be unified, and here a whole bunch of models are at play that aren't very unified at all. But at least the maps shows us that, right? We augmented it a bit with more specific information, the things that are external. In this case, we didn't really talk about what's upstream or downstream because at this point we were still just figuring out the big landscape before diving into details. This actually took a day to produce probably. And well, we could start to talk about patterns, but at this point in time for this organization, that wasn't very helpful. Well, this wouldn't be the DDD community if I weren't talking about heuristics, right? So a heuristic is use the medium. So make sure that whatever is your biggest problem is on that map. And in this case, it was, well, the big bubble in between that was trying to be everything. And this is something that you'll hear in many mapping communities. Do realistic mapping, not just here in the DDD community, where Evans talked about it in the book, where Alberto Brandolini has been saying it when it comes to event storming, because event storming, to some extent, is obviously also mapping, but also in other adjacent communities, like Wardley mapping. We can't really talk about how we want to transform the landscape if we don't show the current situation as is. And so from a DDD perspective, we say, well, just map the various contexts at play, and if you encounter something weird, put a dragon on the map and move on. And in this case, in this other map, that is, again, something that is very clumped together. In this particular situation, I had to call it a naive context map because otherwise people didn't want to talk to me because they said, this isn't true. That's what happens a lot when we're talking about mapping. This isn't true. Well, of course it's not true. It's a map. It isn't a perfect representation of the landscape because that would be the landscape itself. But again, we see here that we can map things in such a way that we can show additional information like, okay, here, the blue stuff, this is the cool new digital transformation thing. And oh, here in the top, there's the external stuff, the things that we really don't have control over. And this is public and this is private. But there are a lot of things that could be improved about this map. There are things that, aren't optimal. The map leaves a lot to be desired. One of them is the accessibility of the map. If a context map is about, is on the boundary or on the overlap of project management and design, how are we going to make one of those with managers if we're going to be talking about bounded context? They'll be like, bounded what? Yeah, bounded context. You know, a logical separation of models that can be unified, and we protect them with a boundary, perhaps in the form of an application service interface for our bounded context. And they'll be like, sorry, what? So maps could be a lot. Those maps could be a lot better. And the second thing is, can we sort of anticipate based on our map? So for the Dutch people among us, they all know this graph. This is from a website called buienradar.nl. That's basically where you can see when it will rain in the Netherlands, which is quite often. And it's actually a GIF, so you can see things progress over time, and it allows you to anticipate change. So you can wonder like, well, will I make it in time to my appointment without getting wet? So this is a very fundamental tool for every Dutch person. So now you know about it for the next time you are attending Domain-Driven Design Europe. But based on this map and based on the context of my question, I always know if I'm zoomed out well enough, if I can truly anticipate the change, right? If I have to move within Amsterdam, that's sufficient. But if I have to move in the Netherlands, then I probably want this because, see at the top there, that's a cloud, and that thing is moving over there, and it's going down. This map allows me to do that, but a context map doesn't really provide us with that. So it's difficult to know for the particular decision at hand, am I looking at enough context? Do I see enough of the environment? And does this map tell us anything about the ecosystem that we're operating in? I mean, this was for a semi-private organization, but still, there is an ecosystem that this is a part of. And actually, there are market forces at play that want to compete with this organization, but we don't really see that. This is a completely internal affair. So can we really make realistic decisions about what is the best way to move forward? And another thing about this map is it's very structural. It's these things related to this other thing, related to this other thing, which creates this system bias in terms of how we're looking at the world, rather than more process-oriented, looking at the value for a particular user or customer or whatever we're calling this actor. So a context map, as I've been drawing them, and I think many people in the DDD community, gives us a very structural view, which produces structural models. Well, but isn't there something in the community that we could maybe use for that? Of course, event storming, because have you tried event storming yet? So that is providing us with a more process-oriented view, and that's great, right? Because we've all seen that event storming is rather easy for people with no background in domain-driven design or in the software community at large to participate. Uh, we can show them an incremental legend, tell them first about domain events and explain them as well. They're just sentences in the past tense that are important to you. And then, people are encouraged to put them on a canvas and we can get started. It has a very low threshold to get started. We don't have to tell them what a bounded context is. So that's good. So that helps us with mapping. And it's very biased towards what we're doing for the user. Huh? It is very process oriented, which is great. But it's not perfect either, because everything looks equally important, right? All of those stickies, they're all the same size. And this is a comment that I've frequently heard while facilitating event storming workshops. Everything looks the same, but not everything is equally important. How can we separate the big from the small? And also, what is the largest part of the flow? Perhaps we could visualize that by marking things up, but we don't have a unified notation for that. And another one, like, how do we document this? I don't know if any one of you have ever been event storming and got this question, but this is a frequent question. How do we document this? Well, detailed maps can be difficult to document. And we could solve that with tools, but tools create bias towards the people that have the tools. And the picture, it still isn't the full story. Because there is this sort of artifact contradiction that mapping is more important than maps, right? Maps are great, but the act of mapping is actually better, right? If you were there, then you understand the abstractions that you created in your map. And so any map that we'll create doesn't tell the full story. Well, what can we use to augment that story then? Well, another thing in the DDD community to the rescue, right? Nick Tune's bounded context canvas. Well, you probably heard about it earlier in this conference because people spoke about it, but it can be a great way to articulate the details that matter when we're talking about bounded context, and it can help us contextualize the design, and it can help us understand the assumptions that went into a thing, but it's not visual. And we'll need many pictures because for each bounded context we'll have one of these. And that doesn't really tell the story in one easy way, right? So someone named Simon Wardley, he is the inventor of Wardley maps. He spoke at this conference 2 or 3 years ago, I don't remember. I'm going to show you Wardley maps later on. But before I do so, I want to talk to you about how he perceives maps. And he says, well, the model of a map is the following. A map is visual. We can look at it and it's visual. Well, great. Event storming, visual. Context mapping, visual. So we got a check mark there. Woohoo! So a map provides us with context. It's about a specific battle or about a specific question. And I think event storming and context mapping provide us with that as well. A map has position, and we can point at various areas and say, over here, that's where we want to be. And when we're doing event storming, we do that in the form of a hotspot. And when we're doing context mapping, we can draw an X somewhere on the map, or we can put some arrows somewhere, right? But in order to have a meaningful position, we need an anchor, right? He says, if we have a map and I can move some box and the map doesn't really change, then it's not a map. And this is where things get a bit quirky, right? Because in event storming, we do have it to some extent. If I have a domain event here on the canvas, it probably means something else than when that same event happens later on in the timeline. But that's just the horizontal axis. The vertical one doesn't provide any meaning. So perhaps we could make event storming maps better by giving the y-axis a meaning as well. Perhaps we could do something with the happy path always goes up and the edge gaze always goes down, that as we progress lower and lower, things get more edgy. I don't know, it's just a thought. And the same could be said for context maps, right? I found it difficult to give this one an orange or a green because movement in the context maps that I've been drawing was never really present. You can experiment with making upstream systems literally visual upstream, but that often is quite involved. It requires you to redraw the map multiple times or use some software that does that for you. But again, then we only have one axis. What would the other axis mean, right? So, and this also means that something for movement. Movement in a map is like going from here to there. That allows us to anticipate change. Think about that buienradar thing that I showed you, right? The map that allows us to anticipate rain. That is because movement is possible in a map like that. But in a context map, we're lacking that. Or we can do it, but there's no standard or uniform way. Well, fortunately, we do get another green check mark for components. We have things and they have a clear, unified meaning. So, okay, that's good. So I first thought, well, okay, let's maybe, try to look for ways to create context maps that do have an anchor and that do have movement. And then I was speaking to Cyril Martraire, and he said, well, why would you do that? Why don't you just use Wordly maps as a better way to do context maps? And so let's just say, not invented here, doesn't really matter. Let's start looking at some maps. Let's look at some examples. And I thought it's at the end of the conference. I probably need to cheer you up every once in a while. So this is my dog, and he wanted to play with examples. So let's look at an example of a map, right? I need to do a lot of clicking here. So I'm going to make fun of my former business in ticket selling. If I'm selling tickets for events like this, then one of the things that I want as an organizer, I want to be paid out up front. And I want to do data-driven marketing. Oh yeah, by the way, I also want to sell tickets, but that's really not my primary need. And in order for upfront payout, I need something. And in order for data-driven marketing, I need something. I need buyer information, I need capacity management, I need payment collection, I need higher conversion, and I need a ticket shop. I need to buy tickets. Buying tickets, yeah, but we also need to check them at the door. No one really wants to do that. That's just, it's a necessary evil. Everybody wants people in as fast as possible. We need seating plans. Oh yeah, customer-friendly order process, customer-friendly seat selection. Oh yeah, risk management. We don't want to give people money if, oh no. I thought I had prevented myself for this mistake by adding a sheet in between, but apparently I took that out. I'm sorry. So, not too far. Yes, okay. So, right, so we have a chain of needs now. Like everything that I need in order to facilitate a want. So, if we would do this with a group of people, well, the question, how do you facilitate that, right? Well, the answer is very simple. What would Alberto Brandolini do if it were an event storming workshop? Everything that you do in an event storming workshop, you can just copy shamelessly and apply it to context mapping workshop based on Wordly maps. So the first thing you do is you ask people to individually identify the anchor so that people work in parallel and we don't immediately have a difficult discussion about what the anchor is. And once everyone has written that down on a sticky note, you put it on the wall and then you ask people to compare so that we have cross-pollination. But then, again, we're going to work in parallel. So we say, well, please all identify what those anchors want. What do those users want from you. And again, we let people do that individually, and then we put it up there, and we have people agree or disagree. And then as a group, we'll work together to find the components that we need in order to satisfy those ones. Now this is going to be a bit quirky, because at this point on, we're going through the organization in a very cross-functional manner. So we're going to encounter the language barrier that you encounter with event storming as well, right? That people say, no, it's not a ticket, it's something else. Or no, it's not a payout, it's a payment. Because at this point in time, we're mixing a lot of models, right? So at this point in time, just like with event storming, we have to embrace ambiguity in language. And we just accept it, and we part of the mapping exercise is sort of having a more mature model emerge as we go along, and have our language be more refined as we progress in the workshop. So at this point, we have a chain of needs, but right now, we don't have any axis that means something, right? We have an anchor, so we see that something is close by the anchor or far away, and that means something, but this direction doesn't mean anything. So what does Simon Wardley say? Oh yeah, there was one more. The ticket seller balance. Well, we can anticipate movement in the form of evolution. Everything evolves. We go from the uncharted, Genesis, to the predictable, commodity. Imagine it's somewhere in the 60s, and we're in Dell Laboratories, and a person comes driving up a cart, and he parks something that looks like a fridge, and he takes a cigarette. Person takes a cigarette out of their mouth and says, "Here, a mobile phone." It demonstrates the concept, but other than that, it's far from mobile, right? But the idea is there. And then 10 years later, maybe, Dell Laboratories may be producing custom-built phones for the military. And another 10 years later, Wall Street traders and the weird uncle that we all had carrying around one of those small suitcases. That was a portable phone. And then another 10 years later, in the 90s, all of us having a phone in our pocket. That is the evolution from here to there. And we can anticipate it because we are operating in a market and everything evolves. Now, Simon Wardley has a great cheat sheet to help you find where you are in this chain of evolution by just answering questions. So I'm not going to repeat that cheat sheet because that would be a waste of time. I'm going to say, well, hey, why don't we turn this into a context map? Because now that we have all of these components, we can easily start asking questions like, well, buyer information, what does it mean to be a buyer there? And is that at odds with what it means to be a buyer when we're talking about high conversion or a ticket shop? And we can use a bunch of questions to help us figure this out. And the nice thing is that we're doing this at the end of the workshop now. So all this time, the managers were helping and understanding the conceptual subdivision of the model that we have in our organization. And that map that we have, that we see here, if we remove the bounded context or we leave them on there, it doesn't really matter. It is of use to the business too. Because we can start to anticipate change. Because we know eventually, maybe data-driven marketing in 2016 was still something unique, but by now I can guarantee you everyone has that in their product. And so it helps us anticipate change. Remember this thing? Well, here's what that looks like in a different, from a different perspective. So in this previous one, sorry for going back and forth. In this previous one, I experimented with having upstream be upstream. So these systems are upstream from this. So higher level things are upstream and lower level things are downstream from each other. But here that's no longer possible. So here I added the U for upstream and the D for downstream. Now if we want to talk about where are we going to refactor, what do you think is a good place? If we would look at the previous map, then, from the name of it, perhaps it would have seemed logical, well, important, Maybe that's a good candidate to cut off first, right? Ah. That's very far away from the customer. The customer doesn't really care about it. The customer is all the way over there. The customer rather has stuff here with weird and weirder. Yeah, sorry, I had to change the names. Uh, this is my way of making it NDA compatible. Um, and actually, platform is an autonomous bubble that helps us deal with this green thing here. And by looking at the map like this, for me, it was all of a sudden a lot clearer that these two things should have never been their own bounded context. We could have deduced that from the previous picture, but here it really was immediately apparent. Because although this provides value and this too, both of them are completely constrained by this. And therefore, it would have been very difficult to do a good job. So when we're asking ourselves the question what to refactor, then we want to stay away. We don't want to ruin our budget here in the bottom part of the map. That's where we want to move things from custom built to commodity, perhaps. So in this case, moving to from our precious databases in the basement of the building to the cloud, but that's about it. Okay, so I get to mock my own profession. What's the core domain of consultants? Because we should all focus on our core domain, right? Billing? No? Okay, so this one I'm just going to show you all at once. Maybe take a moment to look at it. So there is a lot going on here on the map, and a lot of it is actually activities and things that we do, and not all of it is software, but that's actually helping us in looking at this situation. This was actually an example that I once did with a consulting company. We event stormed it, and when you're looking at the event storming artifact, where which we can also use to discover better boundaries, right, and to reason about splitting off particular bounded context, because we could make a model that is more pure. If you look at this artifact, you might be inclined to think that the approval process is a great candidate to split off, but really it's very far away from the user. We don't have a lot of value. By looking at this, the only thing that is very clear is perhaps the custom built time tracking should just really not be custom built. Perhaps we should just talk about moving that over to the right and using some standard platform. Noco is a time tracker that I found by Googling, and by moving that over. But obviously the precious developers in this case don't want to do that because, well, but we custom build it and it's such a nice time tracker. Everyone hates using it, but at least we build it ourselves. Well, but the nice thing about this way of making a context map is I can now reason about what is part of that context, what I'm taking over to a new context, and put that all in one picture. But this is obviously not the only place where I can do stuff, right? We could also start to talk about, well, maybe we should do something closer to the user. And maybe we should do something over there, maybe split off something there, because that is going to be a lot more valuable to our consulting agency. But the ability to put it in one picture, to me, that sparks joy. This woman, yeah. And once we're done, so we now have something for that intermediate state, right? We can go from this, explaining what we're doing while we're doing it, to there she is again, to this. Oh yeah, and by the way, a heuristic for selecting consultants is, do you have your own homegrown time tracking? So now that we can see, and now that we have more situational awareness, what can we do with that? Well, that's not the only thing that we can remix from the Wardley mapping community. We can look at other things. Um, Doctrine, as Simon Wortley says, is the things that we do that are valuable irregardless of the landscape. So these are the things that always make sense. Now, one of the doctrines from the Wortley mapping community is remove duplication. Don't have duplication, but create shared services that help us not reinvent the wheel, but utilize the value that is in place in the organization. Well, but we've also heard that there are situations where shared dependencies are maybe not optimal. So one of the things that we can do here as a community is bring these two worlds together and maybe reason about, for example, Nick's Tunes shared services checklist. Oh, that's really a tongue breaker. Uh, so there's a lot of value, I think, in looking at our maps and thinking about, okay, irregardless of the landscape, what are the things that we can really start to do and talk about in the community as doctrines for highly technology driven organizations. And one that comes to mind is refactoring. We don't always want to refactor code itself internally, but the ability to be able to split off subsystems so that we can replace them, that is a quality that we're going to need to change our landscapes. The second one is climate. That's the things that change in our environment over which we have no control. So one of them being evolution. We don't have choice over evolution. People will compete with us and they will productize what we've custom built. And what we've productized, people will commoditize. That's going to happen inevitably, or the whole market is just going to die off, like like Betamax versus VHS, right? But there are perhaps things in our more technology-oriented environments that we could also qualify as climate. Perhaps the ever-increasing order table and the amount of disk space that we have on server AB3217, is that a form of climate, something we don't have choice over? Perhaps for a period of time. And maybe thinking about constraints in our environment like that is helpful. So this is really a call to the community to think about that. Another one is context-specific play. Looking at the landscape and recognizing that it's structured in a particular way for which there are standard ways of approaching it. And some of these we already have in the community, we just call them patterns. Think about the legacy integration patterns that Evans wrote about, a bubble context, an autonomous bubble, exposing legacy assets as a service, etc. These things are context-specific play in terms of Wortley. And I think that we can do a better job and find more of these things. Another interesting one is from Wortley is setting up a spend control office where we are setting some budgetary limit, whether in money or time or story points or whatever. And if a particular team goes beyond or project goes beyond that threshold, we'll ask these people to produce a map of their situation at hand. And by doing this, we're creating a sensing engine in our organization that is going to map for us so that progressively as we go on, we get better situational awareness of what's going on in our organization. And because Wortley maps aren't as detailed as event storming artifacts, we can start to collate these maps so that we get a bigger, so that we get a more comprehensive and complete picture of our organization. And that helps us challenge the ideas that should have never been executed. And it also helps us get situational awareness in our organization. And the last one is profiling, looking at the maps and looking at similarities, trying to find shared services and seeing if people put these on different axes of the evolution. And does that mean it's the same thing but perceived different, or is that literally duplication that we might want to remove? And then the question obviously is also, are there perhaps other forms of meta-analysis on maps that we could do that are helpful if we look at things from a DDD perspective? Okay. What about our design process? So based upon the position in the map, we can design different. And I wasn't sure if looking at a map would mean that I'd come to the conclusion that DDD isn't valuable everywhere. But I think in every area there is a value of some part of DDD. In Genesis, that's where we do wild experimentation, lots of experimentation, and those ideas we just stick them behind an interface. And when I'm saying experimentation, I want you to experiment with models and not necessarily with the implementation. So make a model, but what the implementation looks like at this point in time doesn't really matter. Just make it fast, because this is where we want to fail fast and learn a lot. And what could that look like? Well, here in the top is the maybe shut up and take my money. And we're not quite sure yet. So here we want to do something very close to the customer, and we want to experiment there and think in models, but the implementation doesn't always have to be perfect. When we're in custom build, we have probably two approaches. Either go for things like bubbles or for distillation. So what does that look like? Well, here we have a bubble context that is providing access. Here we have an anti-corruption layer to this big old legacy monolith part that we had before. And that can be a way to extract the value out of that custom build thing and productize it more so that we can add value in our industry. Another approach could be distillation, right? So we're saying something from weirder, we're extracting it, and we're productizing that into our new, well, I called it distilled here, but obviously you need to have a good name. Weirder distilled sounded a bit off, so. Yeah, and once we're done, we've improved the landscape because this thing is now a lot smaller. Another one could be the product area, okay, where large-scale structures can help us productize some of the domain models that we have. So think about a layer design in your domain layer to ease, to productize sort of the configurability of your custom-built solution, so that we take things from the custom build to the product space. And in commodity, we want to conform to standards. So think, for example, about this line here, billing clients. There are standard published languages that help us deal with interacting with billing systems. And we can also think about, when we're in commodity, when we're the player that is commoditizing, then we want to know where, if we're making a change in the model, and we want to be very, we want to make sure that we know where to be conformist and where we are evolving our model for our own good. So, what's next? Well, as a community, I want to ask you all to experiment with Wordly maps as a way to do context mapping. And the second one is I want you to use Wordly's model of a map to make the graphs that we currently have in our community and turn them into maps. So, thank you.
Thank you, Marijn, for a great talk. There will be a Q&A, so if anybody has questions, now is the time. We have the little microphone box here.
And it's very risky. I can't throw. So, so maybe someone on the front row. No. Any questions? Okay. Ah, yes. True to my name. Yes, good.
Testing. Excellent. One question I'd like to ask is, one of the reasons I haven't done Wordly mapping myself is because trying to figure out the 2 dimensions and the position. So would you have any advice on that, on choosing things, or would you just go with maybe the standard ones there, distance from the customer, and then the evolution of the product.
Yes. So my advice would be to stick to Wardley's model of to really stick to the frame of a Wardley map, because this has been something that has proven to work. And perhaps simultaneously or in parallel, as an industry, we can look at ways, other accesses if they are more valuable to us. But given the fact that this is so helpful in business in learning to anticipate change, because that's really what the evolution axis allows us to do, I think that's where the value is in that. Because this approach opens up the context map in a way that it's now no longer an internal affair, right? We can put something on the map in custom build, but the difficult person on the team can say, yeah, great that we've put it there, but let's be real. Our competitor, for them it's not custom, for them it's product or commodity even, because they are on the cloud or they are using this standard approach. And so that helps us really challenge the way we think about technology in our organization. And I think that's the valuable part of it. It opens it up in a way that doesn't make it more difficult, but that does open up a lot of the assumptions that go into context mapping as we currently practice it.
Thank you. Sold.
Okay.
Any more questions? Okay, I guess that is it then.
Okay.
Thank you, Marijn. Give it up for Marijn.